example, that Britain is the country that has been in some ways most affected because it's not yet in recovery. The size of the financial sector has been a huge factor. But continually in the UK coverage, one of the issues is always comparing Britain to other countries in Europe and America. And that's one of the big factors for the government, because they made so much of the fact that Britain was the best in Europe, the best in the world. Now it was very difficult when it looked like in some senses our figures were the worst in the world. Now, just to draw this together at a close, I mean, there are a couple of things I want to bring out. That I think in the US media, first of all, followed this crisis, as I think Deane was sort of making the point, more, and the Pew study shows, more than actually broke this crisis. Now, the difference was the BBC did, in the early stages, play a more active role in actually breaking one of the key elements of this crisis. So there was quite a difference in the role of the media. The other thing I think that was different was later on, the crisis for the US became much more focused on the political battles and the battles in Congress and in the administration over this in some ways, perhaps more than it did in the UK. What we did have in the UK was a much more open debate than we'd ever had in the US in terms of the differences between the different policymakers were revealed. And the other thing I'd say is the sort of scapegoating and the blame game. I mean, I think in Britain we had the blame game starting early about who was to blame, whether it was the media, whether it was the Bank of England. But what was interesting in Britain is that very rapidly the banks became the villains of the piece. And in the popular press, as we've been hearing, you started getting, all these stories about, the scumbag, terrible bankers, the greed. And as if, we started having the Archbishop of Canterbury appearing on the Today program, our lead program, saying it's all about greed. If people would just have a more Christian view and not be greedy, this is how we could solve our problem. So it really became very personalized. And in a way, I think, in some senses, took it away from any analysis in the sense of what was happening to just the fact this was evil and greedy. I think that was different, because in the US, I think what's curious to me is that eventually the story became the government and whether it was incompetent rather than whether the banking system was incompetent. And I think this is a difference between the two systems. Now, as I said, I think that we did see a lot of shoot the messenger at various stages. It's the media that's causing the crisis. If you just shut up, I'm sure we could sort it all out among gentlemen. We did see a lot of the spectacle that we didn't quite have in the US of the bankers saying sorry. And we saw the regulators make a surprising recovery from what was admittedly a very bad early start. And we saw the central bankers also now becoming, in a sense, the new policymakers in this crisis, both in the US and the UK, in a sense, running the show. And ultimately, we did see the public blaming the politicians as much as anyone else. Again, the final point, lessons. I think in the UK and in Europe, we now take this more seriously. In the US, there's almost exhaustion. I don't think there was the same coverage after a year as there was in the US, because people are just fed up, exhausted, want to go beyond it. In Europe, I think, and Britain, we're still trying to evaluate it, understand it, and see how this has changed the global paradigm. I think also the global aspects of this crisis received a lot more attention outside the US than inside. I mean, the fact this crisis spread to every country in the world so quickly, in a sense, shows that the globalization has its downside as well as its upside. It spreads disaster as much as it spreads prosperity. And the question about, again, that we're asking probably more here than in the US is, what about the paradigm of globalization? Has that changed? The other big issue I think we haven't yet confronted is whether and how economics has changed. Are economic theories, efficient market theories, now no longer correct, and what new theories, behavioral economics, should we do? And finally, I think the issue it does raise to me is we have a global event here, very similar in many countries, but we don't really yet have a global media. We do have media that interprets it differently in every country. And something I think we should really understand is how all events are filtered through national media and national cultural developments. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was just tremendous, Steve.